The HD6450 is a card that I really liked as a budget option just over a year ago, as it gave some gaming horsepower to little SFF PCs, but now, one whole year on, how well does it fare? This right here is the AMD Radeon HD6450, a card I looked at just over a year ago in a video that, although informative, wasn't exactly some of my greatest work, although the benchmarks are still apparent here. It features a KCOS Pro based architecture based on the Terascale 2 series, with a whole 160 shader units coming into play. It clocks in with 625 MHz on the core, and generally sees itself paired with 512 MB of DDR3 VRAM, with memory clocks around the 600 MHz mark on most of these cheaper models, with something that can be pushed up quite a bit on virtually all systems. There are a few variants out there with GDDR5, but despite them having GDDR5, there's virtually no performance disparity whatsoever. It uses around 15 watts under full load, increasing to around 22 to 25 watts when under fully overclocked settings, and pushed to its extreme maximum. In the examples we'll be showing here, you're not going to be pulling more than 20 watts from a card like this, so it's no surprise here that the card is solely cooled by a lump of metal. These things are all over eBay and can be found locally when businesses and schools upgrade their systems, and because of this they are extremely cheap, coming in at around £10 and usually under this. And because they're from school systems, they usually include a VGA connector, making it useful for those older systems where you're likely going to be using a VGA monitor, as you won't be pairing this with any modern systems. I'd imagine most people will be pairing this with a Core2Duo or Core2 Quad, which will see similar performance to what's shown in the videos, as we're just testing to see the full performance of the card. Now, there isn't much that needs doing to this card, as the thermal paste of the unit appears fine, so I stuck the card straight in my system and began to fire up some overclocking software, namely the usual MSI Afterburner, where I was able to completely max out the sliders on stock settings, so resorted using the unofficial overclocking limits included within the app, which allows you to go beyond the default options. Primarily you have to focus on trying to get the core and memory up together as much as possible, so that one part isn't limited by the other, something that isn't too much of an issue on the GDDR5 variant that unfortunately we don't have. Realistically though, the performance disparity, as I mentioned earlier, is pretty much non-existent between these two variants. But anyway, at the end of the day we scored a pleasant 861 MHz on the memory, 760 MHz on the core, which is actually a rather poor overclock compared to a lot of people are targeting, so on most cars you should expect to see clocks around this mark, and power consumption was only around 20 watts from running under full load with an overclock like this, so don't worry too much about overclocking being a risk, but it's not too difficult to do on a card like this. All benchmarks have been run with these clocks, and in terms of actual usage it gave us an extra 2 FPS boost in most instances, with 5 FPS being the peak increase at the best of times, but it did translate into some slightly better frame times. But what exactly did this look like in terms of real-world gaming performance in 2018? First up, we have today's most popular game, with Fortnite running in the 360p resolution, which is as far as the in-game settings would let me go down to. We saw a near constant 30 FPS on the ground when in a quiet area, but the descent was extremely painful and personally responsible for the low frame times presented in our 1% and 0.1% lows. With further tweaks, I could see the game being somewhat playable, but realistically, in some of those dense areas, the frame rate is not going to be high and not ideal for a competitive experience. Still, this is a sub £10 SFF graphics card that can go in literally any system with a PCI Express slot, which makes it a blind sight better than just using the integrated graphics from around the era of those PCs' release. And if you thought Fortnite looked bad, then you will definitely not like PUBG. Sure, it was a steady 10 FPS, but even then it was borderline unplayable, which isn't exactly a good thing considering Fortnite was ever so nearly just playable, and this game did in fact look worse. In fact, it looked so bad it nearly gave me a headache while I was trying to play. I nearly got a couple of kills in game, but the input latency was also so high that turning around in game to see the competitors was also enough of a competition in itself against the game, as the game would often drop frame rate due to the high load being put on the card. I will say that PUBG, for all its faults, was able to fully utilise the card and use it to its highest potential, which wasn't exactly much in a game like this, although we did see near 100% usage at all times. Rocket League, while using the low settings and a few unintensive medium settings, ran at a nice 33 FPS average while in the 800x600 resolution, which looks decent once you get used to it, and it's decent that you can actually run the game in the first place. I mean, the game does run okay in 720p, but it felt a tad sluggish in comparison due to the frame rate present, and you get the idea. You really need a decent frame rate to play Rocket League, and a stable 30ish FPS is perfect. Given that the card can go in any small SFF family PC, you can get in some of those newer indie titles like this absolutely fine. In fact, I found the experience to be pretty competitive despite the 30 FPS average, and even some of the stages I played on the card remained the same, so you can get away with playing this game on this graphics card. Crysis ran perfect. If perfect means low settings in a sub 720p resolution, but for the most part the experience was very smooth, hovering around that 38 to 40 FPS region, with some minor dips beneath that reflected by the 1% and 0.1% lows, which weren't ideal at all. But then again, I've seen so much worse, and the fact that a little SFF graphics card that sells for so cheap can run this game so well, it's definitely an achievement and a testament to the card. The game doesn't look bad, but it doesn't look spectacularly good either, but it's definitely playable on a 6450, and the first Crysis is actually a very good game. The latest version of Minecraft ran great with 57 FPS on average with decent frame times if you exclude those 0.1% lows down to 16 FPS, which was partially due to the hitches when loading a large area and was only momentary, as in it only lasted a second when the game was loading in those new chunks. It's not much of an issue, and we ran the game with the majority of the options set to fast, but some of those options set to fancy to keep some of the nicer effects in game. Overall, the game looked decent and about as brilliant as you'd expect Minecraft to look, and it was a nice experience at 60 FPS 1080p. Hitman, the latest one, ran at 5 FPS, which isn't spectacularly good and is completely unplayable on the system. Virtually no setting changes helped whatsoever, and the game proved to be very slightly too intensive to run on such a small card, but that's sort of what you have to expect with those new releases. Fallout 4 was a similar situation to Hitman, where we had a steady average of 11 FPS, but even then it didn't really look like it was worth getting into the playable experience zone, as we were far from that 30 FPS region most of us consider playable. You may modify the INI settings to get a playable game by lowering the settings even further, but realistically the stock game is not going to run nicely on a 6450, which is a bit of a shame, but I guess it was worth the test anyway. To contrast this completely, games like Skyrim run absolutely fine in just above the 720p resolution, with low settings primarily and a couple of less intensive options set to medium, which is where the card really shines. You can play some of those older AAA titles on your home family system, and it's a very fluent version of the game, and is actually more fluent in some areas than the console port of the game, and definitely is smoother than the PS3 version. We had a few frame time related issues, but nowhere near as bad as it can get on those consoles, and although the game did look slightly worse than that, the game could even shoot as high as 60 FPS in some regions, and was just very smooth on such a cheap card. Elite Dangerous ran well enough to be considered playable, but was very blurry due to how low I had to scale the game, as for some reason any resolution above this would cause the game to run at around 20 to 30 FPS with heavy drops below this, and I have no idea why this was the issue, and it could possibly be a driver side related issue. Oddly enough, if you can deal with the blurriness, the game was very playable and was very smooth, and I did enjoy my time playing it, but you do have to play in full screen, as if you try to play this game in a window like this, it is not going to look nice at all. CSGO is a game people kept asking me to test in 640x480, as I previously tested the game in 720p. So with these settings the game saw a very fluent FPS of 54 FPS, which is somewhat decent, but given the game relies on a high frame rate, generally people won't be too happy about this given the game is CSGO. The majority of the issues span from frame drops and smoke, which led to our frame times overall not being too great. Overall, for the majority of the time, as you can see, the game was absolutely fine, so you can put the 6450 in your little family system and maybe get into playing a little bit of CSGO, just not too competitively. Finally, I tested Rainbow Six Siege, which operates way better than I thought it would, being on the cusp of playability for a large portion of the time, with an average resulting down to 23 FPS. Admittedly, when the game started and defaulted using the Ultra preset of the game, we were running with about 1 frame every 10 seconds, and it took me far too long to get the game down to actually being playable and comprehensive, but with the lowest settings possible we saw a nearly playable experience. So with a few more tweaks, outside of what you can do in the base game, this could very well work properly, but generally I wouldn't recommend tweaking such a multiplayer game as they tend to be temperamental with anti-cheat. Then finally, to round us off, we wanted to see how the card compares to other cards, so I booted up 3D Mark Firestrike, in which we scored a GPU score of 385, which isn't brilliant given that it's around 1/5 of the power than an R9 255 or a HD6450, which are very capable budget options and great for an SFF if you can find them. But for a little budget GPU, the HD6450 managed to make some kind of mark on the 3D Mark results, which is somewhat decent for such a cheap low-powered card. So in conclusion, what were we really expecting from the HD6450 a year after my original video? Well, despite the performance in some games, I'm very impressed with the card. Most modern titles ran somewhat okay if you can handle sub 30f frame rates for some times, and older titles like Skyrim will run absolutely flawless on such a simple card, which is really the reason why you should buy one of these if you have a little SFF system to put it in. It'll run the majority of older titles absolutely fine provided they're before the 2012 mark, although overclocking is a bit of a necessity. As we saw, it's a very easy thing to do on such a basic card, so if you've got a little SFF family PC, why not spend a tenner and get this running better than your poor integrated graphics card? It's not a bad option, it's not great, but it's better than nothing, which is all it ever really needed to be. If you've got a full-size PC, maybe check out the likes of a GTX 460 or another card like that, which will blow this thing out of the water. But let's say you're stuck with a small family computer and you want to upgrade it, why not grab one of these? Because I've loved using it, and admittedly I'd used it for the full 3 days, and I had no issues at all playing the games that I like to play, as I play a lot of older titles and newer simple games. In the end, I hope you enjoyed this video and found it somewhat useful for those of you that needed help finding a little SFF graphics card. Thank you very much for watching, good night. Thanks for watching once again, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. You can catch us over on Patreon if you'd like to vote on the next video, or you just want to watch some previews from behind the scenes. So I'll catch you guys in the next video, and I'll see you then.